Hello, Imperfect Leaders. I am so excited. My new book, An Imperfect Leader, Human-Centered Leadership in After Action, is now available. You can order it by going to Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I've seen it online in lots of bookstores. Thank you so much for your support. My guest today is the Chief Ruckus Maker himself, Danny Bauer. We talk about a lot of things, so I won't delay very much other than to say that when asked when my podcast anniversary was, I didn't have a clue. So I looked and I discovered that September 7th will now be an important day in my life. Hopefully, more important to my family than my half birthday. Because no matter how much I try to push the half birthday thing, they actively refuse to acknowledge the day. They are one oppositional bunch. You know who's not oppositional? Danny Bauer. He is inspirational. Thanks for tuning in. Today on An Imperfect Leader, we have a very special guest, the Chief Ruckus Maker of Better Leaders, Better Schools, Danny Bauer. Now, you might be asking yourself, what makes a ruckus maker? And I assure you, I'm going to ask Danny that. But before I do that, I want to set the stage a little bit about why today is really exciting. Danny describes himself as an unorthodox leadership coach who loves to ask the following question: why follow the rules when you can make them up? He hosts a podcast that ranks in the top 0.5% of all shows worldwide with over 2 million downloads. And he is a best-selling author of Mastermind, Unlocking Talent Within Every School Leader. And I'm very excited to share that he has a third book coming out this May, Build Leadership Momentum: How to Create the Perfect Principal Entry Plan. He has mentored thousands of school leaders through his Better Leaders, Better Schools blog, books, podcasts, and powerful coaching experiences. And he believes with all his might,
when you get better, everyone wins.
Danny Bauer, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Peter, it's great to be here. Like I said, I interview a lot of people and have these great conversations, and I'm looking forward to ours. Thank you for flipping the microphone around and having me on your show. It's an honor.
That's awesome. Well, Danny, it's an absolute honor to have you join us on An Imperfect Leader. And, I started my podcast in September, but before I even released my first episode, I encountered the Better Leaders, Better Schools podcast, and I found your website. I read your origin story. I discovered you, and then I saw the incredible community of ruckus makers that you were supporting. And I wonder, would you take a minute and just describe to us how one becomes a ruckus maker?
Yeah, for sure. September what? Do you remember? For you, I'm just curious. I'm going to answer your question, but I'm already
listen to this. He couldn't get like 2 minutes in without starting to flip it to be like, oh, no, I like to do the interviews. No. Don't worry about when it started for me. Talk about your origin story.
Here's why I asked. And to everything I share, there's always like a deeper lesson. So I started Better Leaders, Better Schools back on September 2nd, 2015, right? And so I have that in my calendar, and it's an annual recurring, almost like a birthday. I call it BLBS, Better Leaders, Better Schools, Origin Day. And so on the 2nd of every year, I'm going to do something special for myself and celebrate, right? So that's why I was asking you about September. You don't have to answer it now, but for the listener too, the imperfect leader listening, what is maybe when you started that new role or whatever, right? Like things that you create, and just make sure you're celebrating, because I don't know if you could relate, Peter, as an effective leader and somebody who accomplishes a lot of neat things. It's easy to move from goal to goal to goal without slowing down and, expressing some gratitude and just enjoying, what you've been able to do.
I think you raise a good point, because in any school setting, you want to create rituals and routines. There are sort of points along the year that you look forward to in terms of celebrating the good people who you get to spend your days and time with. And so what a great example of being able to recognize it's an origin date, right? And so being able to celebrate September 2nd, that is meaningful. I'm going to look back and see when I first started and maybe set something up similarly.
So what does it take to become a ruckus maker? You make 3 decisions as a leader. So the first decision is that you invest in your continuous growth, right? And obviously, at least from my perspective and my instincts and gut and experience working with leaders, the top performers are constantly growing, right? And they're not just waiting for it to happen. We're going to grow sometimes just naturally, right? But if we are reading and taking courses, going to conferences and events, if we have a coach, join coaching communities and that kind of stuff, you're gonna move a little bit faster, right? And learn a little bit deeper. So that's the first decision. Second decision is challenging the status quo. And a lot of times there's beautiful, wonderful traditions that exist in our communities. And then there's some traditions that haven't been, really critically looked at for quite a while. They serve a student, they serve a community that no longer exists. Yet the tradition remains. And it actually not only isn't serving who is now the community, it might even be harming them. And so we want to just critically think about everything we do. Why do we do that? Almost like a 2-year-old, why is there a cloud in the sky? And just question everything, keep what's working and challenge and reform the rest. The third and final decision is committing to designing the future of school now, right? That's probably one of the biggest critiques of education. And we've been hearing this for years now, factory model and blah, 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 right? That's like a really old argument about why education doesn't work. Okay, but what's the solution? So that's why Ruckus Maker starts thinking about, let's actually design the future of school right now. And if you make those 3 decisions, you're aligned with how I show up in the world and serve school leaders.
What a great response. I was thinking about number 2 in terms of challenging the status quo. One of my guests early on, Quentin Shepard in Texas, he talked about looking at his school that had changed considerably over the last 30 years and how the same Halloween tradition was happening at his school. And his after action review was to look back on the decision to, as he was called, canceled Halloween. And really what he wanted to do was rethink how they might engage in a tradition of the community coming together for a school district that had very high free and reduced lunch percentages, where it was a real challenge for children to get costumes and to participate in the same way that the community looked 30 years previous. And so he challenged the status quo. And this is where I'm wondering what advice you might have for those leaders, because I do believe that when you challenge the status quo, the system will work aggressively to return to stasis. It likes status quo. Yeah. It's comfortable in status quo. And I wonder, what advice might you give, or as you mentor and coach leaders who respond to you, I want to be that ruckus maker. But boy, it's not so easy when you start to agitate for change.
Yeah. I wonder why people sometimes think that it should be easy, right? And then not only that, what if it was easy? And that's actually a coaching question I like to ask, this big, hairy, ambitious goal you have. What if it was easy? How would you show up? And that's a good coaching question in terms of not overcomplicating things. But really think for a moment, what if you got your wish that it was easy? Would that be interesting? You know what I mean? Like, it would be so boring, whether it's leading a system or running a race, if there was no hardship and challenge and push, it's zones of proximal development. We're going back to Vygotsky, but like, you have to be stretched. And so welcome it, because not only do you help whatever it is you're working on evolve, I think you evolve as a person too. And that's interesting. That's where, to me, like experience life, that's where the value is. That's where you can see that you've made your mark. Everybody's not cut out for it. But I just know for me, the type of leader I am and how I show up, if I'm not creating and helping things evolve, I would be so bored. There's people who are maintainers, and you might need that for a team too in certain situations. But that's just not me, right? And for what education needs, and I think for most leaders, They take that new position because they want a quote unquote bigger impact. Well, how are you going to have a bigger impact if you stay the same? It's not even possible. Like the math doesn't work. So
I like that. Particularly, I like how you stepped us out with a different metaphor. All right, step out of the school setting and use the metaphor of preparing for a marathon. That takes a lot of time, effort, pain, setbacks, successes, setbacks, reflection, preparation. It's hard. And so what if it were just completely easy? Yeah. I like that as a nice metaphor for sort of shifting one's thinking to consider where other parts in our lives we might have those challenges. In the leadership model that I use to advise others, and I imagine there are parallels in the principal success path that you use to advise school leaders, there's a dimension, leaders learning work. And that is the mind of an organization's work. And inside that dimension is a term using the power of language. So things like framing, story, narrative, or as you just used, metaphor. And each are distinct ways to communicate and transform. And so, Danny, I know language is really important to you. And so when I listen to your podcast, you gently encourage your guests to give examples. Why is that important?
The examples and the stories show us how it's done, right? You could talk about making a pie, but if you don't bring me to the moment, I'll never really understand it. And you want to connect and move people to change, right? So if we're talking about challenging the status quo or designing the future of school now, information is only okay. But when you connect with people's hearts and you move them through story and through examples and this kind of thing, then they actually do it, right? Because they have an emotion. They connect in a visceral way. Maybe they even tear up a little bit, but then they want to take action, So that's a huge piece. I like to say that ideas are great, but not the greatest, right? And what's better than an idea? Well, it's taking action, At the end of the day, we're in the results business, in terms of school systems and doing something for our students ultimately. And so unless you're taking consistent action and creating results, you're really just wasting everybody's time. So, to me, that's why it's so important.
Would you give us an example of how you have worked with a school in terms of rethinking, moving from idea into action?
Sure. Well, you talked about the power of language in this this program we have called the Principal Success Path, and that has a lot of projects and tools embedded within the program. One of them is the idea. Remember, ideas are great, just not the greatest. So the idea is we want to create spaces, right, that are welcoming and inclusive, that people are excited to be at, right? Like I would hope that folks that come to your school, whether they're staff members, students, or whatever, are like excited to be there, right? They're excited. What are we going to do today? What are we going to accomplish? Who are we going to see? Like, what problems are we going to solve? So creating that kind of environment, that's the idea. How do we get there? And if you really reflect on most schools, not all, some are doing it really well, but think about the entrance, the first touch that a student or community member has when entering the building. And is it creating the experience that you want? The majority of places, if you really think about it, the answer is going to be no. And so that's okay. That's what I do, is like things that might be visible to me are invisible to others. And so let's talk about that entrance. And all right, what are all the emotions? What do you want to hear students and people saying as they're coming in? What do you want them to feel? What do you want them to think, experience? All right. And then how are we going to design the entrance to make that happen? So I was working with a principal who's in the East Coast. Her name is Glenda. And we met at a conference. She joined the Principal Success Path. She does this one project with the tool on redesigning the entryway. And Peter, I'm telling you, literally had been in the program for a week. Her staff returns this is summer break. So they're coming into the start of a new school year. And they say, Glenda, what has gotten into you? What did you do this summer? You've changed. I don't know, whatever it is, keep it up. Right. And she only took action on this one idea of redesigning an entryway. And it was putting up pictures of students, signage, like the type of phrases and things like, it didn't have to be a huge, heavy lift, but before it was completely sterile, like a hospital, when you're walking in, it's bureaucratic. It has no soul. Right?
Yeah, you see signs that say, don't take one more step without signing in as a visitor, right? As opposed to, as Margaret Wheatley, a researcher out of University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a great writer, she talks about how to talk to people and how to have meaningful conversation. Yeah. But she also references this cultural field, is how she references it, that as you enter it, you almost immediately understand what is valued here.
It again, not a heavy lift at all, but the staff said, whatever you're doing, keep it up. And I talked to her last month about this topic. And she said that momentum from that first day, redesigning the entryway, has continued throughout the school year, right? So it's paid off all these months. They're almost done with the school year. And that's just like one thing she's taken action on.
How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Peter, I say, that's me. That's how it resonates. And to connect some dots, right? So the listener, the imperfect leader listening, can't see behind me, but I have these tiles designed, right? And they're called culture tiles, and they're made by a company too called Gaping Void, in case anybody wants to check them out. But basically, they take ideas or values and things that are important to you, and maybe what you teach within your system or what I teach to school leaders, and then they illustrate them and just make them really cool. And most people that see these, they comment on them. I could tell a story about every single one, and it helps spread ideas that I want to spread. So anyways, over my left shoulder here, this goofy looking guy that says, remember rule number 6. There's a longer story there. Happy to tell it if you want, but the punchline is quite simple, which is don't take yourself too seriously. And I think it's really hard if you are holding things too tight and you're not flexible. You're not going to be willing to learn from mistakes. You might try to hide all that type of stuff. You'll definitely want to put on a facade, a mask. Nobody's perfect. There's nobody perfect. The hero that you look up to, if you really got to know them, they have flaws, and that's okay. And I just know that, I learn from mistakes. Every single one makes me better and helps me grow. How do I resonate with it? It's me, Peter. It's me, an imperfect leader.
And we'll be right back. An Imperfect Leader is brought to you by EdConnective, whose mission is to ensure student success through transformative teacher training. EdConnective helps teachers move from awareness about strategies and frameworks to successful and consistent implementation. Their friendly coaches celebrate classroom success with teachers, and with concrete classroom data, support teachers in their growth, one step at a time. I've been thinking about this a lot. During the pandemic, student teachers didn't get a chance to do their student teaching with children. They just started teaching in classrooms. And they need help. Across the nation, states are adopting higher expectations to make up for learning loss. That's where EdConnective fits in. Their vision is that every student deserves a great teacher, and every teacher deserves a great coach. Find out more by contacting them at edconnective.com. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And our guest today is Chief Ruckus Maker of Better Leaders, Better Schools, Danny Bauer. And I want to remind our listeners that Danny has a best-selling book, Mastermind, Unlocking Talent Within Every School Leader. And more importantly, or equally as important, is his new book that's coming out, Build Leadership Momentum, How to Create the Perfect Principal Entry Plan. So in this segment, Danny, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they made, and then we discuss it. So what happened?
I get feedback. You're always getting feedback, whether it's formal or informal. This was formal feedback, right, from my supervisor. And essentially, the feedback was that I wasn't visible enough, right? Was it true or not true? I don't know. Doesn't really matter. That was the feedback I received from somebody important in my professional life. And I was absolutely brand new to a school. And so I thought about, well, what could I do? Right? That's the problem to be solved. And at that time, what is it, like 2017, maybe? I think it's 2016, 2017 school year, I want to say. I saw principals and assistant principals posting quite a bit online, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, about their mobile offices. I thought that was a neat idea. I think I may have even interviewed a few people that brought that up, right? Now, I'm not super duper handy, although I'm growing in that skill. So I didn't make anything. And really my mobile office was just dragging a student's desk from a classroom, right? That wasn't full into the hallway. And I'm like, all right, well, most of my things are all digital. So in the hallway, 100% of the time, unless I must take a meeting that requires like privacy or something like that. And so I did that. And then I received some more feedback, Peter. Can you want to guess what it was, or should I just tell you? It doesn't matter to me.
I'm going to guess the feedback you were getting was that people felt that you were almost like a helicopter, or that you were spying on them, or that you were, I can't think of the adjective, so I'm going to let you jump in.
Basically, I was so present, like they felt like they had zero privacy. Yeah, like the helicopter. Like
I love it.
I was like
you became the Velcro principal.
Yeah, and now I'm getting disciplined, right, and getting a negative feedback about you're still doing it wrong, right? And that was super interesting.
So one of the pieces that you're hearing is, okay, that you are now too visible, and that individuals don't necessarily have any autonomy because you're omnipresent. So what got overlooked?
So I one of the things that got overlooked, I think, was just, so there's second order consequences and then third and fourth, right? So I didn't even consider those tertiary and whatever the fancy word is for fourth order consequences are. But yeah, I was only like, okay, I'm not visible, I'm going to be very visible. And that was the choice I made. So it was potentially a very big overcorrect. But I received, I was open to the feedback and received it. And so I wanted to make sure that people did see me, but boy, did I make sure they saw me, right? They knew I was around. And so now they didn't like that.
One of the wonderings I have as you're sharing the story, and I have an image in my head because I think this is very familiar for new principals and new superintendents, new assistant supes who have now been elevated out of the principal role. And elevated is maybe not the right word because every leader has his or her or their role. When you move out of the principalship into a central office position and now you're in schools, you're trying to figure out what that relationship looks like and how to do that well. And I'm wondering, one of the pieces that may have gotten overlooked as you're looking back is that unintended consequence that you mentioned of having a shared image of what does visibility look like in our building? How would you like me to be visible? How do I make this decision with the people most impacted by it? And I guess that will lead me to my third question, which is, what did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, for sure, like new relationships in terms of just getting to know staff that was open and interested in getting to know me, as I consider myself a very relational leader, for sure back then, and definitely what I do now. I received that feedback from actual staff members. The other thing I learned about some of those, relationships was that, you definitely can't please everybody. And one of the things that I learned through the experience as well is that this wasn't feedback I was receiving. This was behind the back, given to a supervisor type of feedback who then told me. And I never could get a real sense of who's really who has the problem? How can I address this with them? Is this the majority of the staff? Is it two really loud members, And I'm not saying one's better than the other, or, in terms of value or weight, because, people that are connected, right? That matters a lot. And that was a huge learning for me too, was understanding the political nature of the system in terms of relationships. And as a novice leader and, younger, I didn't get that concept at all. I was so naive that you could just show up, that you had the right intentions, that you're a good person and a hard worker, and that everything will be okay for you. And a lot of times it will be, but especially in a place where I found myself, which was very traditional, uh, had their ways set, talked about innovation and change, but that wasn't actually happening, right? So when things got challenged a little bit, it was just really hard to rebound. And so there was a lot going behind the scenes that underneath the surface, I really just had no idea.
That's so interesting when you consider the system thinking, and if you use that underneath the surface. So use the metaphor of a glacier, and so you're changing your actions and you're adjusting based on feedback. That's what we can see above the water. However, below that water are those traditions and rituals and systems that have been going on for a long time that are fueled by, even below that, those mental models that have existed in that place. Did you replace a long-standing leader? I'm curious whether the scenario is a revolving door of principles, or after a long time, now you are the new person.
It was both. So I was replacing somebody who got moved out of the building for some really poor professional choices. And we won't go into that, but like things, if you do it, you should be moved out, right? You shouldn't be leading a school. And then that person had replaced somebody who had been there forever, right? And was adored, loved, and really wanted the faculty, some of them, and I think more the parents, come back, that type of thing. So yes, you are.
So yeah,
very
wow,
astute,
what churning
onto something.
Well, yeah. I'm just sensing there was some real churning going on, and there was, when individuals are anxious, upset, rudderless, to use another water phrase, or something to do with water, then their actions, sort of their behaviors manifest in a very sometimes unproductive, because they're just they don't know what to do. They're scared. That must have been really frustrating for you.
The whole thing was frustrating, because up until this point in my professional career, and then at every instance afterwards, I've always thrived in every setting and have become the department chair, the district lead, or I always find myself excelling. And literally, this is the only time in my professional experience where supposedly I was underperforming, and I just never could figure it out. And the answer wasn't more hours or working harder and that kind of stuff. I just realized, I think the folks that really have the power just don't think I'm the right fit, or I've upset them or violated some rule that I didn't know existed or something. But that would never change, no matter. I would have to be a different person. And it took me probably years of reflection actually to figure that out. Because in the moment, I just was completely bewildered. I just had no idea what was going on, to be honest. It was painful.
Painful, yeah. What is something that, as you look back, you could have done differently?
Well, the overcorrecting, this is just a microcosm of every choice I made there, right? So I think the one thing I would have tried to have done differently is, and I'm assuming now that I've had experience and stuff like that, I could have caught on to what was happening sooner rather than later. But I would have acted more in alignment with my values and just shown up more as an authentic leader, because it was a no-win scenario. It really was. And, it would take time. I have the tools these days, if you fast forward, 7 years, but to not take it as personally, because I did, and to have tools to let it go outside of the work hours. So it was something I thought about too much too, and that impacts your quality of life, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing, and it really shouldn't have, but it was a good learning lesson.
As I've listened to your conversations with your guests, as I've read some of your blog entries, and I've gotten to learn more about you, I imagine, because this is the 16-17 school year, and if we go back to September 2nd, 2015, this is a year after the ruckus making is beginning. So it's in its infancy, that you initially were making some technical changes when, as your advice I have heard you say, is it really is about attending to the people first. And I wonder, looking back, if that's what you're suggesting in terms of what you might have done differently.
Yeah, that could have helped too. And actually, you bring that up, and I always forget to share that in that part of the story if I do tell it. I wonder if what I was building was somehow a threat or a perceived threat. And I had never, ever considered that, because I was thinking, hey, I'm building this network. I've got access to some like really interesting people that if I just picked up the phone, they'd probably come to the district and like do something for us. You know what I mean?
They're like, slow down, Danny. Look, status quo has been good to us. You want to, yeah, exactly. You want to live rule number 2 and challenge the status quo. We're not asking for that.
Yeah. And that was only like dreaming type stuff. Cause I will tell you, the superintendent gave me on a piece of paper, basically like directives, like do not change anything at the school, which was really interesting because based on the interview, it was about innovation. And I laid out a plan on what I would like to do. But then I received that, and actually I didn't change things. And this is sort of a second part of the story, but now I'm in trouble for not changing anything. And I'm like, but the superintendent. So whatever. But it's all pretty wild and crazy. So at the end of the day, just being more comfortable with who I was. And the biggest learning, and this is what I want to say to the imperfect leader, because you'll find yourself, everybody's going to experience a tough bit in their professional life. How can you be thankful for it, right? And for a little bit, I was like, how do I get even almost? You know what I mean? I don't even know, like, how do I prove them wrong is maybe a better way of saying it. And then I eventually was able to let all of that go. And again, it's about gratitude, because when I reflected on, this pushed me to actually do Better Leaders, Better Schools full time. And it's working. And everybody that I'm touching and coaching, they're growing like crazy, right? So yeah, that was painful, but now I get to do this.
Yes.
All the time.
Had you not experienced that, it may have impacted your ability to authentically and genuinely coach individuals who are stuck in that moment. It's hard to say, I know what you're feeling, without really knowing what you're feeling. So, I mean, there's empathy in there, but I think your role is also about compassion, right? Not just feeling with people, but actually being with people.
Absolutely, that presence piece. And who knows if this stuff, if we'd be talking today, right? Because maybe that school would have been so successful and me so comfortable that, this little side hobby thing, is actually taking too much time. And
although I imagine you'd also be in some physical therapy for dragging a heavy desk around a building all the time. So, you know what? I'm glad and I'm thankful for your own physical safety as well. My guest again was Chief Ruckus Maker, Danny Bauer. And Danny, throughout this entire episode, I kept thinking of a quote by author Rutger Bregman. He wrote Humankind, which has been on my mind for many, many months. He wrote about humans and our behaviors toward each other. And he said, anytime we cross paths with a stranger, we could stop to chat and that person was a stranger no more. The guests who have been on my podcast, I really believe, have been ruckus makers, but at the superintendent level. And they are leaders who are willing to be vulnerable. They are leaders who follow the themes that you referenced today in terms of, mindset. You talked about design, you talked about culture, and to some degree, you talked about how those leaders who work closely with you will begin to get the results that they hope to get. And so many of them have felt that they were alone in the world until they just stopped to chat. So thank you for being an inspiration to me. and to the many Ruckus Makers out there who are determined to create a better future for others. I really appreciate you.
So good, Peter. I'm so glad we're connected, and thanks for having me on your show.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action.